All right, let's get right into it. Over the last 50 years or so, the entire landscape of American childhood has been completely transformed. I'm talking about a huge fundamental shift in how we care for our kids, how we educate them, and it's all been driven by massive changes in our economy and in family life. So we're going to break down how we got here, and maybe more importantly, what it all means for the future. Everything really kicks off with this one number, 57.3%. Now, what is that? That's the percentage of American moms with a kid under 1 year old who were in the workforce back in 2013. Now, to give you some perspective, just think about this. Back in 1976, that number was only 31%. I mean, that's not just a little change. That is a seismic shift in the American family. And of course, that incredible jump in working mothers created this brand new, really urgent question for millions and millions of families. If mom's at work, and a lot of times dad is too, who's watching the kids? It seems like a simple question, right? But the answer has reshaped pretty much everything, from our local neighborhoods all the way up to national politics.
So here's our roadmap for this. We're going to start with how the workforce got so transformed in the first place, which leads us right into the childcare question. Then we'll look at how all this was happening right as there was a huge push to remake America's schools, which, as you can imagine, sparked a massive debate. And then we'll wrap it all up by connecting it to what education means for your future.
Okay, first up, a workforce transformed. This didn't just happen out of the blue. It was really a combination of big social changes and some key laws that paved the way for more women to not just enter their careers, but to actually stay in them after having kids. And you can really see the legal framework being built piece by piece here. In '76, you've got the Child Care Tax Credit, which just made working more financially viable. Then, a huge one in '78, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, protecting women's jobs. In 1993, FMLA provided job-safe leave. And even more recently, the ACA in 2010 helped new mothers in hourly jobs. See? Each law just knocked down another barrier. But it wasn't just about what was happening in Washington. Society itself was changing in some really big ways. On average, mothers were getting older and way more educated, meaning they had more invested in their careers. And at the exact same time, the number of single-parent households tripled. And for a lot of two-parent families, that second income wasn't a luxury anymore. It was an absolute necessity. So, with way more parents working longer hours, we come right up to our second big topic, the child care question. All of a sudden, a whole generation of kids started coming home from school to an empty house, and that created a whole new set of worries. And this is where we get that now famous term, latchkey kids, right? It was used to describe kids who'd let themselves into their own homes after school, with a key on a chain around their neck, and were basically unsupervised until their parents got home from work. It really became a symbol of this new American reality. And we're not talking about a small number of kids here. By 2014, it was estimated that 11 million school-aged children were on their own after the bell rang. That is a massive number, and it really pushed parents and policymakers to start seriously looking for a solution. And a solution did start to emerge: the rise of formal after-school programs. And you know what? The data showed they really worked. Kids who participated were linked to better attendance, better behavior in the classroom, higher test scores, even better health outcomes down the line. These programs were filling a really critical gap for working families. Now think about this. At the exact same time that this childcare revolution was going on, there was a completely different kind of revolution brewing inside the schools themselves. And that brings us to Section 3, Remaking the American School. Back in the 1980s, this kind of national panic started to take hold. There were all these reports coming out saying that American students were falling way behind their peers in other countries, and that fear, well, it kicked off decades of intense federal involvement in setting national standards and holding schools accountable for their results. Probably the most famous product of that whole push was the No Child Left Behind Act in 2002. It was really built on these four big ideas: stronger accountability, which mostly meant testing, more flexibility for states and local districts, more options for parents, and a big focus on teaching methods that were actually proven to work. But that centerpiece, standardized testing, it became incredibly controversial. On one side, advocates argued that tests were the only objective way to make sure that every single kid, no matter their background, was being held to the same high standard. But on the other side, critics were really worried it was creating this teach-to-the-test culture that just narrowed what was taught and pushed critical thinking to the side. And that debate didn't go away. It kept right on going with the next big reform, Common Core.
This quote from the historian Diane Ravitch really gets to the heart of the tension so many people felt. The goal of having high standards, everyone agreed that was good. But the rigid, one-size-fits-all approach, that raised some serious questions. So this new, intense focus on standards and performance, it really opened the door to some even more radical ideas about how our schools should be run. And that leads us right into Section 4, the Great School Debate. Right at the center of this debate were school vouchers. Supporters saw them as a tool for fairness, a way to give low-income families the same school choices as wealthy families, and to force public schools to get better by competing. But opponents argued that vouchers would just drain badly needed money away from public schools, all without any clear evidence that they actually improved how much students learn. Another really big piece of this whole school choice movement was the growth of charter schools. The basic idea here was to create schools that are still publicly funded but are run independently. They get to be free from a lot of the usual regulations in exchange for a promise to meet specific performance goals laid out in their charter. So, after decades of these huge, sweeping changes in childcare, in score form, in parental choice, where does that leave all of us today? Well, that's what our final section is all about: education and your future. The tough reality is that even after all those reforms, a student's family income is still one of the best predictors of their success. I mean, look at this from 2012. Students from the wealthiest families had a dropout rate of just 2%. For students from the poorest families, it was 12%. That is a massive gap, and it's still with us.
And on top of that, the financial pressure is just getting more intense. This table really breaks it down. Even public K-12 education costs over $11,000 per student a year. But then look at college. We're talking nearly $22,000 for a public university and almost $43,000 for a private one. The cost of entry is just incredibly steep. So why on earth are families paying it? Well, it's because the economic payoff is just impossible to ignore. A person with a bachelor's degree can expect to earn a full $1 million more over their lifetime than someone who just graduated high school. And a master's degree, that adds another $400,000 on top of that. Education is still an incredibly powerful economic engine.
And that's exactly why, even with those eye-popping costs, college enrollment is expected to keep going up. And what's really fascinating is the projected growth among adults over 25. It shows that we're moving toward this idea of lifelong learning, with people constantly going back to school to get new skills for a rapidly changing economy.
And all of this leaves us with one final and really important question. We've seen the American family get totally reshaped, the school day get reimagined, and the education system get turned upside down. So now, with the cost of that education soaring and the economic stakes higher than they have ever been, how will the next generation manage to navigate that incredibly complex path from the classroom to a career?